All right, so a lot of you have been asking us to do a deep dive into the Highway of Tears.
Yeah, it's a tough story.
Yeah, it really is, and it's complex.
Very much so.
Yeah, so we're using an article from the Canadian Encyclopedia as our guide today,
Okay, sounds good.
and we're going to be covering like the historical context and some specific cases, and then really looking at the fight for justice that is still happening.
Right, and I think it's important to say right off the bat that the Highway of Tears, which is a 724-kilometer stretch of Highway 16 in British Columbia, Right. it's become synonymous with these disappearances and murders of so many women, and particularly Indigenous women.
Right.
But it's not just a true crime story. It's like deeply rooted in systemic issues
Absolutely, yeah.
and, the vulnerability of Indigenous communities.
Right. And the article really emphasizes the location, like the geography of this highway and how important it is.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Can you explain that a bit more?
For sure. So Highway 16, it serves as like this vital link
Ah.
for a lot of remote Indigenous towns and villages,
Right.
connecting them to essential services in larger urban centers.
Yeah.
For decades, it was the only transportation option for a lot of people,
Wow.
which sadly led to, increased vulnerability, especially for women who had to hitchhike because there was no reliable public transport.
It's wild to think that it took until 2017 to get consistent bus routes.
Yeah, like just imagine for years,
Yeah.
the only way to access healthcare or visit family or even just get groceries was to rely on hitchhiking,
Oh my gosh.
a situation that exposed so many people to danger.
And then when you talk about the number of victims, it's even disputed.
Yeah, that's a really important point. It
Yeah.
highlights how complex this whole issue is.
Right.
The RCMP, they officially recognize 18 cases between 1969 and 2006.
Okay.
But Indigenous groups say the real number is much higher,
Wow.
possibly over 40.
Gosh.
And this discrepancy, I think, just shows the challenges
Yeah.
in really documenting and acknowledging the full extent of this tragedy.
Right. It really shows how cases can be overlooked and the distrust that exists between Indigenous communities and law enforcement.
Yeah, that distrust, it's deep-rooted.
Right.
It stems from a history of, systemic injustices.
Yeah.
And this perception that cases involving Indigenous women just haven't received the same level of attention or urgency.
So the RCMP launched Project EPANA in 2005 to investigate these cases.
Okay.
And they had specific criteria for
Yeah.
including cases in their investigation. So can you explain that a little?
So EPANA really focused on women who were involved in what they considered high-risk activities like hitchhiking or sex work.
Okay.
And their disappearances or deaths had to occur near certain highways like Highway 1697 or 5.
Okay.
This approach, while they were trying to streamline the investigation, drew criticism
Yeah, for sure.
because it maybe introduced bias and excluded cases
Right.
that didn't fit those very specific profiles.
Right. So there were concerns about whose stories were prioritized.
Absolutely. Like, were certain victims considered less worthy of investigation?
Yeah.
And, this feeds into that distrust
Right.
and reinforces that feeling that these cases weren't always treated with the sensitivity and seriousness that they deserve.
The article also mentioned VIC-LAS, the violent crime linkage analysis system.
Oh, yeah. Thick class.
Yeah, and it was used in the investigation. So can you tell us a little about what that is and what role it played?
VICLAS, it's basically this powerful tool that helps investigators find potential links between cases that seem unrelated.
Interesting.
Yeah, it analyzes crime scene details and victim profiles and things like that
Oh, okay.
to spot patterns and connections that people might miss.
Yeah.
So in the context of the Highway of Tears, VICLAS was used to explore the possibility of a serial offender
Okay.
or to identify, shared characteristics.
You're trying to connect the dots.
Yeah, exactly, like by analyzing the data through VICLAS.
Right.
Investigators hope to get a clearer understanding of the connections between these tragic events and maybe uncover new leads.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we've talked about this broader context, but it's important to remember that behind these statistics are individual stories
Oh, absolutely.
of real people.
It's so crucial to personalize this issue.
Yeah.
We're talking about real people, each with their own story.
Right. And the article highlighted a few specific cases that have come to define this tragedy.
It's so important to remember that.
Yeah, one case that I think really stands out is Monica Jack, who was only 12 years old when she disappeared in 1978.
Ugh, heart-wrenching.
Yeah.
Imagine just a child riding her bike
Right.
near her home and then suddenly vanishing.
Oh my gosh.
Her remains weren't found for 18 years. And it was only recently that her case was solved using DNA evidence.
It's crazy how long some of these families have to wait for answers.
Yeah, it's just unimaginable.
Yeah.
And the fact that it took nearly 4 decades
Yeah.
to bring some closure to Monica Jack's case,
Right.
it just shows the systemic challenges and
Yeah.
delays that have hindered justice for so many.
Another case that really sticks with me is Ramona Wilson,
Yeah.
who was 16 when she vanished while hitchhiking in 1994.
Right.
And her story was featured in the 2006 documentary Finding Dawn.
Finding Dawn. Yeah, it's a powerful film.
Yeah.
It does a really good job of highlighting this broader issue
Yeah.
of missing and murdered Indigenous women in Canada and the factors that make them so vulnerable.
And then you have the story of Doreen Jack,
Oh my gosh.
which is almost too difficult to comprehend.
It really is.
Doreen, her husband, and their 2 young sons, 9 and 4 years old,
Yeah,
they all vanished together in 1989.
a whole family gone.
It's hard to
It
imagine.
really underscores the devastating impact
Yeah.
this tragedy has had,
Right.
not just on individuals, but on entire families and communities.
Yeah.
Like an entire family disappearing without a trace.
Mm.
It just speaks to the depth of this crisis.
It's hard to even fathom the scale of that disappearance.
Yeah, and the lack of answers just adds to the anguish.
Right. It shows that this isn't just individual cases,
Yeah.
but this huge systemic issue that's affected generations of Indigenous people.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's heartbreaking.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
So we've talked about this distrust between Indigenous communities and authorities and this feeling that justice hasn't been served for a lot of families.
Right.
The article also talks about this 2015 email scandal
Yeah.
that kind of eroded that trust even further.
Right.
Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so this incident, it really added to the anger surrounding the Highway of Tears.
Yeah.
It came out that government officials in British Columbia had been deleting emails
Wow.
related to these investigations.
Oh, wow.
And not just deleting them, but using this method called triple deleting to make sure they were gone forever.
That sounds so suspicious, what was in those emails.
That's the thing we don't know.
Oh, God.
The content of those emails is still a mystery.
Right.
But their disappearance raised huge concerns about transparency and accountability.
Of course.
Like, it just fueled this speculation about cover-ups. And it made people feel like the government wasn't taking the issue seriously.
It's understandable why families would be upset.
Oh, yeah.
It's like one step forward, 2 steps back.
Right.
But the article does talk about some efforts towards positive change, like the 2006 Highway of Tears Symposium.
Okay, yeah.
What was the goal of that?
So the symposium, it was a big step towards addressing this tragedy.
Okay.
It brought together families of victims, Indigenous looters, advocates, law enforcement.
Wow, a lot of different people.
Yeah, to discuss the issue, share their perspectives, and figure out solutions.
Okay, so an attempt to bridge that gap.
Exactly. It was a recognition that a multifaceted approach was needed
Right.
to tackle this complex problem.
So what came out of the symposium?
They came up with a huge list of 33 recommendations
Okay.
to improve safety and address the root causes of the violence.
That's great. Were those recommendations put into action?
Well, sadly, very few of them were fully implemented.
Oh, that's so disappointing.
Yeah, it really contributed to that ongoing frustration, that sense of inaction that a lot of families felt.
It's hard to hear that those efforts didn't lead to more change.
Yeah.
But the article also mentions a national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls.
Oh, right.
Launched in 2016. What was the scope of that?
This was a big turning point.
Oh.
You know, after years of people demanding a national investigation,
Yeah.
Canadian government finally launched this inquiry
Okay.
to look into the systemic causes of violence against Indigenous women and girls.
So looking beyond individual cases.
Exactly. They traveled all over the country gathering testimony
Wow.
from families, survivors, experts.
That must have been intense.
It was a really crucial process, giving voice to those who had been silenced.
And what were some of the key findings?
So the final report came out in 2019,
Okay.
and it was a landmark document.
Okay.
It concluded that the violence against Indigenous women and girls in Canada constituted genocide.
Wow, that's huge.
Yeah, that term sparked a lot of debate,
Right.
but it highlighted how serious this issue is.
So what were some of the recommendations from the inquiry?
They issued 231 calls for justice.
231.
Yeah, addressing a whole range of issues,
Wow.
from racism in the justice system
Right.
to the need for better access to education, healthcare, economic opportunities.
That's a lot to unpack.
Yeah, and they called for a national action plan to implement these recommendations.
Okay. Have there been any tangible changes?
It's still early, and progress has been slow,
Okay.
which is frustrating for a lot of people.
Right.
The government has committed to a plan,
Okay.
but implementation has been delayed. There's still so much to do.
Right. We talked about the lack of safe transportation being a big factor.
Right.
And I know the article mentioned bus routes being established along Highway 16.
Yeah, in 2017 BC, transit finally launched 3 new bus routes along the highway.
It's kind of crazy it took until 2017
I know, right?
for that to happen.
It shows how overdue it was.
Yeah.
These routes have given people a much-needed alternative to hitchhiking, especially for women and girls who are the most vulnerable.
That's great. But the article also mentioned a setback in 2018 when Greyhound Canada ended service in the area.
Yeah, Greyhound leaving created a gap in transportation.
Right. Yeah.
Especially for people traveling long distances.
Okay.
The BC transit routes helped.
Yeah.
But they didn't replace Greyhound completely.
Right. So still some challenges there.
Definitely.
It seems like addressing this issue requires a lot of different approaches.
Absolutely.
Like tackling the safety concerns and the bigger systemic factors.
For sure. It's a complex problem.
Wow. It feels like we've just scratched the surface here.
Yeah, definitely. It's a really complex issue.
It's not just about solving individual crimes.
Right.
It's bigger than that.
It really is. The Highway of Tears. It forces us to confront some really uncomfortable truths about the impact of colonization, systemic racism, and the lack of support for Indigenous communities.
The inquiry using the term genocide.
Yeah.
That's really powerful.
Right. It's a stark reminder that reconciliation needs more than just apologies. It needs concrete actions.
Right.
To dismantle these systems that perpetuate this violence.
Yeah, so where do we go from here? Like, what can people do to help create meaningful change?
That's the question everyone should be asking. I think the first step is education.
Yeah.
Take the time to learn about the history of Indigenous peoples in Canada, the impact of residential schools, the struggles they still face today.
That historical context is so important.
It is. And then, once you've educated yourself, look for ways to get involved, support. Indigenous-led organizations, donate to causes that you care about, amplify their voices.
What about people who feel overwhelmed by how big this problem is?
Start small. Even small actions can make a difference.
Right.
Talk to your family and friends. Challenge stereotypes and misinformation. Support Indigenous businesses and artists.
It's about creating a culture of awareness.
Exactly. And remember, change takes time.
Yeah.
It doesn't happen overnight.
Yeah.
You need sustained effort, a commitment to challenging the status quo. Don't get discouraged if progress is slow. Every step towards justice and equality matters.
This has been a really eye-opening deep dive.
Yeah, it has.
It's clear that the fight for justice isn't over.
No, it's not.
What final thoughts would you like to leave our listener with?
The Highway of Tears is a tragedy that has touched so many lives and exposed these deep wounds in our society. But it can also be a catalyst for change. Let's honor the memory of the victims by demanding justice, supporting their families, and working together to build a future where all women and girls are safe and respected.
Thank you for guiding us through this tough but really important conversation.
Of course, it was my pleasure.
And to our listener, thank you for joining us. Keep learning, keep engaging. Knowledge is power, and together we can make a difference.